What's up, YouTube? It's your boy JP on the keys, and it's two. He's running the video today. We have the falling of World War II, something that a lot of you guys have wanted to see. So without further ado, let's get to it.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see.
Man, you just got to really get to really feel for a lot of these kids that were in this war, because a lot of them were really young, like 18 to like 22, 24, like just graduated from college or just graduated from high school. A lot of them really don't know what the war is about, and like they go out and die for the country. You know what I'm saying? This is not even just the America. This is not just America. This is all over the world. You got young men, because like I think it was only men that were really allowed to join the army back then. Like the women were usually like nurses and like medics and stuff like that. But these young men who were in their very late teens or early 20s are risking their lives. Like, that's definitely takes a lot of guts, I'll tell you that.
See how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese.
Yeah, that's got to be so crazy, just knowing, let's say you're a wife, you're somebody's wife, and you kiss your husband before he goes off to war, and then you have to get a letter in the mail, or somebody knocks at your door, like, oh, we have bad news, your husband died in the war. Like just think about that. Like you have to wait weeks in advance for a letter, or just wait until somebody knock on your door. There's really no way of communicating back then besides like letters, for real, like writing letters, and like maybe with telegrams or getting on a telephone. But I don't know when that would be able to be accessible during war. But just the sacrifice that these men made, definitely appreciate it. Definitely, because war is a double-edged sword. Because war, of course, war is costly, but war is necessary for evolution as like a human race. Because you got to think, if there wasn't war, the United States would still be under British control. I mean, I feel like the colonials would have revolted sooner. They would have revolted sooner or later, but I mean, we might be celebrating Independence Day on a different day. I don't know. If it wasn't for war, slavery wouldn't have been resolved around that time period. It probably would have been resolved a lot later. Like, just think about just think about how it would have been if America had gone into the 1900s, into the 20th century, still slaves. with still owning slaves in the 20th century. Just think about the wow, like just with the technological advancements that would have been made. Just I don't even want to see that.
When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell. So about the same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland.
So, of course, as you know, Germany was the main aggressor. And what I know, Germany and the Soviet Union were like the two biggest players in this war. Like, well, I think both of them suffered the most casualties. Of my estimate right now, I will have to say that at least 20 million people died from this war, from the estimates, because I know this was also Holocaust time. It's just a whole lot of political events that resulted in a lot of people dying. You know, a lot of death, a lot of casualty during this time. You know, not a very bright time in world history. You know, not at all.
Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France.
7 countries. They took over 7 countries. Jeez, the military power on display.
200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides. But the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success.
I'm sorry, I'm pausing, but just think about that concept of, like, you're a war general and you have to go by, oh, I only lost 3,000 men today. Today was a good day. Like, that's crazy. Like, you just knowing, like, going into a battle, you're gonna lose probably half to like 2/3 of your squadron of your force, and it's just like that's the crazy part. Like, you have to go in here, you have to keep these dudes' morale up, knowing there's like a probably almost a 40 to 50% chance they're not gonna survive the battle. Like, this, I gotta commend them for keeping soldier morale up, because if there was a chance that I'm not making it every time, I'm not gonna feel the best. I'm not.
And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front. Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany. The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost. $8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
You have to think about how big that army is. You lost 14 million soldiers and you still won. How big is your army? How huge is your force? You can take losses of 14 million and keep it pushing. So between those two countries, that's almost 17 million people. That's almost 17 million people between 17 million soldiers dead between two countries. 17 between two. That's wow. Like that's insane, bro. That's insane.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time.
I'll probably do that later on my own time.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
So I definitely gotta put my 2 cents in. Like, just what of, like, you can't even really call it like racism. It's not. You can really, like, this is like severe nationalism, severe prejudice, severe just disregard for the human life and well-being. Like, you slaughtered 6 million people because they did not fit your perfect blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan race belief. It's just the thought of what people do to people that they quote-unquote call undesirables. The undesirables are always, you know what I'm saying? It's always, they get the short end of the stick. And like, just the fact that people were able to do this to the, like, these are German soldiers were able to do this to other humans without flinching. Like, you're gonna put 100 people in a gas chamber, and all of them, when you come back, all you're gonna do is you're gonna see dead bodies on the floor, or you shoot a firing squad. They put blinks in your guns, so nobody really knows who killed the innocent people, because they shot blanks. You don't even know which one had the real gun. You don't know. Like, this is a terrible, like I said, a terrible time.
If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt. The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million.
You lose, wow, it's 20 million people. You lost 20 million. These are civilians. These are not counting soldiers. So you put the soldiers on top. So you put that on top of the soldiers. That's 34 million. 34 million casualties. 34 million in one country. That's just the amount of just you know what I'm saying? Just all these casualties, just everything is just unnerving at times. Just the fact that it was so hostile. You know what I'm saying? It was hostile to the point where you, like, your whole entire state or country can be wiped out. Like, everybody, like, massacred, everything.
A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians.
Again, as a war general, you have to, like, your strategy has to be to defeat the morale of not just the soldiers, but of the civilians. The fact that you do this, that you okay with doing this to innocent people. This thing, I know people's like, oh my God, it's war, duh, they always supposed to do bad stuff. I'm just saying, just having to think about that. Like, you have to think in your mind, wow, I have to cut off food supplies so that mothers with babies and weak children and disabled old people can't eat. But you know, that's the best way to beat the enemy. You defeat the morale of the citizens. The soldiers don't have anybody to rally, don't have anybody to cheer them on or to comfort them. No, like, home court advantage, if you know what I mean. Like, that's definitely a destructor. You know what I'm saying? A destructor, bro. A demotivator.
Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities.
Of course, they're talking about America did on civilian. Obviously, you dropped 2 bombs on civilian towns. Obviously, you dropped 2 nukes. You dropped 2 nuclear bombs on civilian towns. You didn't drop them on a military base. You didn't drop them on like on a seaport or an airport or an air landing strip. You didn't drop it on any type of military compound. That was a civilian town. Civilian town. Like 2 nuclear bombs, which the effects are still being felt today. Birth defects, psychological effects. The babies all these kids get special needs because of the radiation, the excess radiation. You know what I mean? It didn't just destroy what was there. It destroyed what was to come. You know that's like I said. Like how do you come to that decision? You know, you just gotta drop 2 bombs, like nuclear bombs that destroy towns. Like I said, I couldn't be in that high power because I wouldn't be able to think about like that decision. You know what I'm saying? It would be some type of feeling that comes in. Like, it has to be.
But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million. Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
See, the earlier you open up a flood on your own people, you control the weather. Wow, you know what I'm saying? Like the high government is in such a position they can do a whole bunch of stuff. Like they literally just manipulated the weather to create a natural disaster that wiped out millions of people. Not millions, but wiped out thousands of people. Like, just, wow. You know what I'm saying? Somebody thinks, oh, let's just start a flood to stop the enemy, even though it might kill 500,000 people. So be it.
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official U.S. statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison,
70 million people, 70 million across the world, like 70 million people. Well, but this is 70 million people in, how long was the war? 6 years? 11 million people dying every year, bro, of the war. That's like I said, and a lot of these killings were unprovoked. Like, these killings were just because I see you, I'm just going to kill you. Just because you're in the vicinity. Like, the point of what people will go, you know, and this was bad for Germany. I know I'm either thinking this was the first, I think didn't the Treaty of Versailles was after World War One, I'm assuming, and then Germany was still mad about the effects. That's why. Then Hitler comes, and then boom, and then you know what I'm saying. You play with somebody too long, you manipulate, you stifle them, and then they come back and then bite you in the butt.
Here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries.
Mideast slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, Mideast slave trade. So the Middle Eastern slave trade was involving like African Americans with like Arabs, I'm assuming. Like, I think, yeah, with the Arabs, because the Arabs have always been, like, historically the Arabs were slaveholders as well, not just the Europeans. I remember that.
World War II had the high.
It's still a slave. It's still a slave. Still like a slave. It's like a slaves in like Libya, in Liberia, like in a little area where they're in the Middle East, right on top of Africa. You know, the Libya, the Egypt. There's still slave trade going on. The media tried to cover that up. Still slave trade going on. Like, people don't want to talk about that. A lot of these presidents in America did not acknowledge this. You know what I'm saying?
Highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase "the long peace" to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II.
You can't do that, because then you'll shut down the world. You can't have the biggest superpowers fighting, because then who else is going to take the lead? Because the United States and China, I mean, I don't know, it's rumored, but a country like the United States and Russia would not want. They're allies for a reason. Obviously, the big strong ones team up, duh. And you pick on the little dude. That's why the United States has been fighting over in Afghanistan, in Iran, and Iraq. Very poor countries, poor countries, like not economically stable, as nowhere near economically stable as the United States. Like the same thing when they went to Kuwait, a very underdeveloped country, like very underdeveloped according to related to the United States. You know, it's never been on someone who's as powerful as you, unless you have multiple allies backing you. Duh, when you have a big country, you have a big military. You know what I'm saying? You never know how good the Soviet military is compared to the United States military. You don't know. And plus, all these 44 countries, most of them have nuclear weapons anyway. The big guys are the ones with the nuclear weapons. You can't have the guys with the nukes fighting, because then that's world destruction.
Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the U.S. versus Iraq. But rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
Like I said, because most of these 44 big countries have nukes. You can't have countries with nukes fighting each other, because then it's always the threat of world destruction if nukes pop off. If the nukes pop off.
To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, And they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all. And here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs.
I mean, but how can you call it peace when the United States and the Soviet Union were on like nuclear weapon standoff for like 42 years? Like we literally had a crisis where we had nuclear missiles right on the Cuban border, almost like less than 600 miles from the Florida coast, which were definitely in range of the U.S. How come it can't really be peace if we went to Vietnam and butted in a war that we really had no business going in, and then we did. Then when we had to get embarrassed because we got outclassed by so-called lower value citizens. How about when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were competing over who would go to space first? Even though the Soviet Union did actually got the first man in space, but then the United States launched the first to land on the moon. That was the first one to land on the moon. The Soviet Union already put a man in space. They didn't put him anywhere. They put a man in space. That's what they did.
Or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
I liked it a lot. I like that. That was a very informative documentary. You know what I'm saying? I like how he organized everything and put it together, just to really show the toll, the human toll that war really. You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes you have to, when you look back on your history, it kind of serves you a purpose to kind of know where you came from, like to know where you improved as a people, like. I think we're past the point of. I can't really say because it's always tension between countries, but I hope we're past the point of a world war. I hope so. I don't know if we are, but I genuinely do hope so, for the safety of everybody involved. You know what I'm saying? We've evolved so much as a people. It's to the point where now we don't have to segregate water fountains, and we have to have certain entrances for people, or we cause harm to people because they don't fit our ideals of a normal human being. You know what I'm saying? We've evolved. Like, we haven't become as barbaric of a people as we were years ago. I mean, maybe we are. Maybe we are, and just I don't see it. But what I've seen so far, I feel like we're a little bit less barbaric towards other people. A little bit. But anyway, thank you again for watching. Leave a like if you're enjoying it. Subscribe if you're new to the channel. Don't forget to share the video wherever you share videos at. Also, don't forget to turn on my post notifications. Check out my Instagram. Follow me on Instagram. Also, check out my beat page link. I added some more beats on there. Link will be in the description. Please stay safe during this quarantine. Stay home, social distancing. Everything that they're telling you, like, please stay home. Please stay home. Don't disobey the social gathering. Don't get in large groups, because that makes you more susceptible to the virus. So just please adhere to the guidelines. But anyway, thanks again. Be safe. Have a great day. Stay on the grind. I'm out. Peace.